A naked man has little to no influence on society. In clothes like this, you step out and you know that you're going to turn heads. You know that you're going to create an impression of a person who cares deeply about the way they look and has a finer eye for detail. And, that seems to be the Bombay Shirt Company way. What I really love about these clothes, and I really mean this, is this looks like a man has walked into the room. I like that. It's nice.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. The widespread violent protests, but maybe the word rebellion is better, that have swept through Nepal in the last few days have taken everyone by surprise. So today we ask fundamental questions. What lies behind this development? What do we know of the situation facing Generation Z in Nepal? And what are the concerns for India, Nepal's neighbor to the south? Those are the key issues I shall raise today with India's former ambassador to Nepal, Rakesh Sood. Mr. Sood, how would you explain the widespread violent protests, or as I said in the introduction, maybe the word rebellion is better, that have swept through Nepal during the last few days? Was it really provoked by the arbitrary decision to block 26 social media apps, or are there deeper, more fundamental causes that we need to focus upon?
Karan, I think that the decision to ban the apps was perhaps the spark that lit the flame, but the kindling was already there. There was a growing sense of resentment, and I think there were enough signs of that resentment earlier. Now, if you go back to what happened in Tunis in 2011, which was the beginning of the Arab Spring, there was this Bouzizi who, who set himself on fire because some petty officials came and upset his vegetable fruit cart and things like that. And then, a days later, when he died in hospital and couldn't recover, it led to a stream of protests, and in 10 days, Ben Ali was gone. So, in a sense, we were seeing incipient signs of unrest. Just a few months ago, you saw the enormous turnout when the former King Gyanendra appeared at the airport. And there were 20,000 people there to welcome him because they felt that they were being let down. So, this is peculiar to Nepal because also Nepal has been in a political transition, and I would say that it has been in a political transition for something like 35 years. So if you give me 2 minutes, I'll explain what I mean by the political transition that has lasted 35 years. See, the first Jan Andolan that took place was in 1990. And that fundamentally transformed Nepal. It brought a new constitution into being and legitimized multi-party democracy. Before that, Nepal had the constitution of Nepal that was adopted by King Mahendra in 1962 had established party-less democracy. So parties were illegal, political parties. It was a Panchayati Raj system of democracy, grassroots democracy, as it was described. Now that changed with the Jan Andolan one. Now that went for a while, but then after a few years began the Maoist insurgency. The Maoist insurgency took its toll. It lasted. The Maoist insurgency finally ended in 2006. And that was the time of the second Jan Andolan, when the Maoists came overground, they were legitimized, and they became a political party from being an insurgency. So that is Jan Andolan 2. And then began the search for a new constitution. That led to the election in 2008, and a new constituent assembly was elected, and monarchy was abolished. So now Nepal was becoming a republic. The new constitution took 7 years to draft. It was adopted in 2015. And so now you have a new Nepal, as it were. I mean, these were the promises of the Constituent Assembly. These were the promises of the new constitution. And in 2015, you see the beginnings of a new Nepal, except that that promise is seen to be betrayed from the beginning itself. So during the last 10 years, it's not as if Nepal hasn't developed economically during the last 10 years. It has. But compared to even compared to other South Asian countries, its development has been much, much less. And that is where the third Jan Andolan, and I can't say whether the current phase of violence that we are seeing, the rebellion as you called it, whether we can call it Jan Andolan 3 as yet or not.
Let's focus on some of the fundamental underlying causes one by one. To begin with, the media is calling what's happening a Generation Z revolt. What are the economic conditions like for young Nepalis? The World Bank says youth unemployment is over 20%, and that's astonishingly high. And newspapers today are reporting that somewhere between 4 lakh at the lower end and 8 lakh at the upper end, young Nepalis leave the country each year. What sort of economic pressure is this youthful generation under?
Well, lack of jobs. As simple as that. Because let me say that today, Nepal's per capita GDP is about half of that of India's. India's per capita GDP in nominal terms is about $3,000. And in PPP terms, purchasing power parity terms, it would be about 4 times as much, roughly around $12,000. But in nominal terms, it's 3,000. Now, Nepal's per capita in nominal terms is just below $1,500. And in purchasing power parity terms, it's about $5,500. So you can see that there is an enormous gap. So where would they go for finding employment? They would come to India, they would go to the Gulf, they would go to Southeast Asia, they would go to Korea, South Korea, and so on. So that's where they have been moving. I mean, it's basically the economics that has been driving it. And also, don't forget, I told you about the 10-year Maoist insurgency. And that was an enormously stagnant period economically. But more than anything else, I think it is also that when we look at the social media apps, now Nepal it's a mountainous country, and connectivity from one valley to the other and that kind of a thing is limited. So what happens is that these social media apps, particularly among the Gen Z, that's how they get their news. That's how it helps them in their education, in their doing their studies, their homework. It is a source of communicating with their uncles or fathers or brothers or people who are outside, because there are about 5 million, 6 million Nepalese who are working outside. It is the means by which they get their remittances and organize that. So when you block en masse, so the impact of blocking these social media apps is much more than what perhaps you and I would be able to figure out unless we know that society and how vital the social media apps are.
Now, the second critical factor, I gather, seems to be the corruption of the political elite, and perhaps in particular the luxurious lifestyle of their children, who are called Nepo kids. Can you tell me about this? When politicians are accused of being corrupt, that's not dissimilar to what we often accuse our politicians of in this country. But what is it that makes the Nepali politician particularly uniquely corrupt and this source of so much discontent?
Well, partly it is that, I told you that in 2015 they adopted a new constitution, so there was a lot of hope about a new Nepal. But since 2015 till now, which is 10 years, you had 9 governments. Now, these 9 governments have been largely a game of musical chairs between the same group of people. If I go back to when Nepal was declared a republic and the writing of the new constitution began in 2008, since that time there have been 15 prime ministers. Once again, it was the same game of the same musical chairs. So in the UML, you've got KP Oli, and he controls the party, and he's been prime minister about 4 times or 5 times.
4 times.
You have 4 times. Prachand has been, he is the leader of the Maoist party. He has headed the Maoist party as general secretary since 1989. That's pretty long time. And he has also been prime minister 3 times at least. You had Sher Bahadur Dioba, who's a long-standing politician who controls the Nepali Congress. And I think he has been prime minister. His first stint was in 1995. And since then, he's probably been prime minister 5 times or 6 times. So essentially, it is the same lot of leaders. And then with this continuing game of musical chairs, there develops a degree of impunity. And each one, they play the same game of I scratch your back, you scratch my back. And as a result of it, the institutions, whether it is the judiciary, whether it is the Commission for Investigation into Abuse of Authority, which is their anti-corruption body, whether it is other institutions that are there, the police and so on, they all get corrupted. Their institutional ethos gets eroded. And I think that is something that has become visible. The first sign of this, incidentally, showed up very clearly in the 2022 election, the last election that was held. Suddenly, out of the blue, you had 3 new political parties. Out of the blue. They didn't exist before. And they did a pretty good showing. You also had the emergence of the gentleman Balendra Shah, who in 2022 stood as an independent, had no political background, was a rapper, and managed to win the mayor's position of Kathmandu by more than 65,000 votes. Because he could relate to the people through his rap music he converted his rap music into his calling card on talking against corruption and things like that. So, but then he is not a politician. He doesn't have a political party in that sense. So the fact that this was emerging was a clear sign of the disenchantment with the establishment politics or the establishment political parties.
Clearly, not only was there a game of continuous, endless musical chairs happening between KP Sharma Oli, Dweba, and Prachanda, but Nepal also, the young in Nepal were looking for new leadership, they were looking for new people, they were fed up with the old. But let me ask you specifically, how much of the responsibility lies maybe specifically with former Prime Minister Sharma Oli? Yuvraj Ghamire, writing in today's Indian Express, says he was increasingly unpopular but refused to acknowledge the fact. The Economic Times calls him authoritarian and out of touch with reality. How much of it was focused on him, his personality, his image, and the way he conducted himself?
Well, I would say that he was the current prime minister. He is authoritarian. He wasn't like this to begin with. I mean, when I was when I met him in Nepal, when I was posted there, he was very different. But I guess power does things to you. So he had become authoritarian as prime minister, and today, but I would say Prachand has been equally authoritarian.
They've all been the same.
So has Deoba been in his party. I mean, see, today, actually, it's funny because this year, by the end of this year, you actually have annual party conventions for all these three parties. And mind you, in all these three parties, there were rumblings of discontent against the leaders. In UML, which is KP Sharma Oli's party, the former president, Vidya Devi Bhandari, who had been an acolyte, who had been introduced into politics by KP Sharma Oli and had done 8 years as president, was announced that she was going to come out of political retirement and stand for the presidentship of the party. Oli was flabbergasted. Oli even got a resolution passed that she cannot rejoin the UML. I mean, so it shows you that there were enough people in the UML who were propping up Vidya Devi Bhandari. In the Nepali Congress, Sher Bahadur Deoba was trying his level best to kind of postpone the general convention of the Nepali Congress till 2027, till after Nepal's general election, because he wanted to pick and choose the candidates. And he was otherwise under pressure. The Nepali constitution did not allow him to continue for another term as Congress president. So his options were either to promote his wife in some fashion, Arzu Deoba, who was the foreign minister, or some other trusted fellow, but preferably postpone the general convention. In the Maoist party, where, as I said, Prachand had been the general secretary since 1989, there were younger lot who were trying to introduce term limits. At their last Central Committee meeting, there was a resolution that we should have term limits. And so there were these rumblings of discontent within the political parties as well against the top leaders.
Let me cite a story that is reported in today's Times of India as an illustration of the sort of person KP Sharma Oli had become. On the 6th of September, an official jeep carrying a regional minister hit an 11-year-old girl, tossing her onto the pavement. And then the Prime Minister, KP Sharma Oli, as he then was, described it as a normal accident. Apparently, this infuriated young Nepal. Is it not a sign of how arrogant and insensitive Sharma Oli had become?
Of course. I'm not denying that. But all I'm saying is that, I mean, I like to look at these things not as a sudden occurrence. I mean, yes, as I said, the ban on the social media apps was the spark. Now, we can find various signs of the growing resentment, and that is what I was trying to explain to you in terms of saying that.
Absolutely. And I was simply suggesting that this one incident involving KP Sharma Oli was part of the spark. It
Part of the same.
Young Nepal.
Yes, absolutely. It's part of the same chain.
Let me ask you a deeper question. Do these developments, all the ones that we've been talking about for the last 10, 15 minutes, do they suggest that the Constitution of 2015 has effectively collapsed? In other words, does Nepal need to recreate democracy from the very foundations upwards? Is that the challenge, in a sense, that faces Generation Z today?
We haven't so far seen any leader emerge from these protests and demonstrations that are taking place. We have seen that Balendra Shah, the mayor of Kathmandu that I mentioned, in fact, on Sunday, he was on social media. He is a very active user of social media. He was on social media saying, "My support is with the protesters and demonstrators." On Monday, he was silent. When people saw that these protests and the manner in which the police responded and the casualties that happened, that took everybody by surprise. So on Tuesday, he urged people to exercise restraint and said, look, government has resigned, so your objective has been met. And then he suggested that now parliament will be dissolved, and which is a bit surprising because if you dissolve parliament, that means you don't have the constitutional provisions, and then means that somewhere you will have to call for new
But
elections.
forgive me interrupting you, Mr. Sood. The demand to dissolve parliament seems to be widespread through Generation Z. Let me quote to you what Next Gen Nepal, one of the organizations behind the protest, has actually put up on social media yesterday. And I'm quoting, "Our generation is now ready to take on the responsibility of the future." They are demanding the dissolution of
Sure.
parliament. So, in
Yes,
other
but
words, this new young generation is fed up with the past. Quite clearly, they want to do away with whatever remains of it and start afresh.
so let's say if we dissolve parliament, then you dissolve all the existing structures, the cabinet, the presidency, the vice presidency, etc. But then what is the alternative mode of governance? And maybe the federal structure that was introduced with 7 provinces. I mean, I do not know. But then nobody has come out with the alternative structure of governance as to what it will be. After all, somebody has to.
Absolutely. There is a perilous vacuum in Nepal at the moment. An old order seems to have come to a close and an end. The new order is not even visible as yet. And we're in that no man's land between the old and the new, feeling our way, finding our way carefully. That is why I imagine that on Tuesday night, last night, the Army Chief General Ashok Raj Sigdal imposed curfew, asserted the Army's control, and has called for peaceful talks. Do you think his voice as an army man will be listened to and heeded? How does Generation Z in Nepal view the army? Do they have the same respect for the army that we in India have for us? Or does the army become tainted because of its association with the political leaders of the past?
I think General Sigdal is also kind of feeling his way because normally, my guess, and I'm only just speculating here, I have no information. Normally, I would have thought that under the circumstances, since the government has resigned, Oli has resigned, the cabinet has resigned, it's an interim government. And given the nature of violence that is taking place, perhaps the president could, as the supreme commander, could invoke the emergency and order the army chief to go out. And so there would be a constitutional transition to re-establishment of law and order, while political consultations could begin on what should be an interim government or a new government or a new election and so on, which would be in keeping with whatever is the constitutional provision. Now, the president hasn't done that for reasons perhaps best known to him. There are rumors suggesting that he also may want to resign, or maybe he didn't want to. So perhaps the army chief's hands were also tied. I mean, he didn't have an authority from the top. The action that he has
He
taken
would have
is kind of,
assumed that authority on his own. After all, there is a
yeah,
perilous vacuum of
I
authority in Nepal
agreed. So,
today.
but at
The
the
army
same
chief
time,
may have assumed it himself.
perhaps sui generis, but that is why he's feeling his way, and he is, I mean, he has also urged dialogue. He has also said we don't know who the leaders are and who are the people who will engage in this dialogue. He has also in his message asked Balendra Shah to reach out to these people since Balendra Shah happens to have their ear. Meanwhile, there was another politician who had emerged in the 2022. He was a media personality called Rabi Lamichhane, became deputy prime minister and home minister after the elections because his party did superbly well. And then he got involved in a corruption scandal and was in jail. But then the jail was, mobs went to the jail and the jail authorities just released him. And so he has gone back and he is ready to re-enter politics. I mean,
Before we start talking both about Balendra Shah and Rabi Lamichhane, and I'd like to talk briefly about both of them, let me ask you a earlier question. As you and I have agreed that it's a complete vacuum of authority, a vacuum of control. There are no leaders to the Gen Next movement that we can see. How dangerous is that situation? Political societies are not used to vacuums of this nature, yet you have a yawning vacuum in Nepal, and no one knows how that vacuum is going to be filled. So, how dangerous is this situation?
It is dangerous, and I think that there are all kinds of conspiracy theories that are being voiced by different commentators who are talking of looking for foreign hands and things like that. Some people think that maybe so, but you're right that the vacuum is there. So we'll have to see who is there some move to take advantage? Is there some move to assume leadership? Does that happen organically? Is that something where so far we've not seen even the shadow of anybody trying to reach out in that sense, except for Balendra Shah's occasional statements, which are so is he somebody who's going to take charge? If so, as the head of an interim government, but then who appoints him if
But
there is no
those are
constitution?
questions we don't have answers to, and maybe the army will appoint him. Maybe the president will appoint him. The point is, you do accept that this present situation in Nepal, this vacuum where you don't have a leader, where the movement doesn't have an obvious face or front, is a very dangerous situation for
Of
any.
course, it is. Because at any point it could conflagrate, and at any point the law and order. What has also happened is that while the protest began as a student movement against this, by the time the protests reached their peak, where houses were being set on fire and things like that, by that time there were groups who were not beholden to anybody. These were not students. These were not the Gen Z. There is enough evidence to show. See, by Gen Z, you would mean people born between 2000 2015, the generation that has grown up, which is a smartphone used, that has come of age with smartphones, hence very used to social media, all the rest of it. So these would be people who are in their teens or 20s who would be protesting. But we've also seen lots of groups with plenty of older people who are going around torching houses, burning cars, etc., etc. So,
Are these just vandals? Are they political groups? Are they just gangs? I mean, do you have any sense of who these others are? Are they just people who are exploiting the situation that has been created to their benefit?
I think they're just exploiting the situation. These are vandals. I don't think these are political groups because the traditional politicians do not want to be seen in public for obvious reasons.
Tell me, against this background, do you think people like Balendra Shah, the mayor of Kathmandu, or the politician that you named, Rabi Lamichhane, the former deputy prime minister, home minister, and I gather he's the chairman of the Rashtriya Swatantra Party, do they have it in them to be able to exercise authority, to command the leadership of Gen Next, to be able to fill the vacuum? Or are they just names that are being tossed around without any fundamental reason why?
Right now, I would tend to your last assessment, which is that these are names being tossed around because there are no other names to go around. And see, as tainted as Oli is, equally tainted is Prachand, equally tainted is Dioba, equally tainted is Vishnu Paudel, equally tainted is, let's say, Shekhar Koirala, who was also planning to challenge Dioba for the presidency of the Nepali Congress. So these are all seen as dynastic politicians who are well beyond their sell-by date.
Okay. Against that background, let's briefly widen our discussion. What sort of concerns does the revolt in Nepal raise for India, given that we have a 1700 kilometer that is an open border with this country?
Yes, so the first thing that we've done, and quite rightly so in my view, is closing the border. It is an open border and we've closed the border.
But can we close
So,
the border? Because we can only close border points, but the rest of the border
no,
is
no,
open.
no. Well, we increase the patrolling, so all of that. I mean, all those mechanisms are there. The SSB, the Sashastra Seema Bal, has the ability to. I can't say that it will be so tightly sealed that not a single human being will cross kind of thing. I can't vouch for that, but you can close it pretty much.
Okay.
And you'll have to do
What are
that.
the concerns that lie behind closing the border? Can you explain? What is it that we're apprehensive of?
Well, we we are a vulnerable society in our own ways. We are a victim of cross-border terrorism. There is nothing to prevent terrorists from using an open border and the disturbances in Nepal and ending up in Nepal and then coming across the border. And so that kind of a thing. In the old days, this used to be a favorite way of getting counterfeit currency into India. So it can be a source of enormous amount of instability within India, and we would like to. But then what it does is it does create problems, because when you seal the border, after all, Nepal depends on a fair bit of essentials, particularly petroleum products and cooking gas. That is all their entire supply of petroleum products and cooking gas goes from India. And when you seal the border, then what happens is that all of these checks and so on, so you will start seeing 200 trucks lined up at each border checkpoint. And meanwhile, you will see petrol pumps going dry or shortage of cooking gas and things like that. So it does lead to a degree of hardship, and it becomes a difficult thing because people are used to an open border.
Now, Prime Minister Modi, in a statement that I believe he issued last night, has called the violence in Nepal heartrending. He's expressed his anguish. How do you think India should respond diplomatically in foreign policy terms to the situation?
Well, I don't think Prime Minister Oli had really endeared himself. He had emerged as a bit of a um, India baiter, as it were. I mean, he kept blaming India. And although it didn't start out like that, but some of his last actions in his last tenure as Prime Minister, where he tried, for purely domestic political reasons, to rake up the boundary issue, the Kala Pani Limpia Dura, on the northern boundary, on the tri-junction with China, India, Nepal, and China, and brought that issue as a constitutional amendment, and
But can I
wrapped
interrupt?
everybody.
I assume Prime Minister Oli is now history, and
His
India's
history.
response is not going to be in terms of either an expression of support or antagonism for Oli. How
Far
should
from it.
India respond to the vacuum that's been created in Nepal today? That's what I'm talking about.
Well, I think for the moment, uh, we have been blamed very frequently, sometimes with reason, sometimes without reason, for having interfered in Nepal's internal affairs. And I think that we should not express any preferences. We should try to ensure that at a people to people level, our relationship, as I said, petroleum supplies, cooking gas supplies, things like that, do not get hampered in a manner that this leads to any kind of ill will at a people to people level or hardship at a people's level in Nepal. And meanwhile, we should be at arm's length in order to let Nepal work out the politics of what is happening, while of course keeping a very sharp eye through the embassy in what is happening to see if there are other vested interests that are coming in to try to exploit the situation.
In other words, it's an arm's length viewpoint that we take. We don't express
With close, with
for anyone, but we do express concern for the general situation.
absolutely, while maintaining very strong surveillance, observation, and intelligence activities in order to uh, find out who is emerging and so on.
Finally, my last question. How do you believe Generation Z in Nepal views the country's two big neighbors, China in the north, India in the south? How do these young people who have risen to the fore in this violent fashion view India in particular?
Gen Z, and this is as true of Gen Z in Nepal as it is perhaps true of Gen Z in India or Gen Z in Pakistan or anywhere. Gen Z doesn't have the same historical memory that you and I have of whether it is India, Pakistan, or India, Nepal, and so on. And their perspective is a much shorter perspective for obvious reasons. They're not looking at what happened in 1947, what happened with grassroots panchayat, what did King Tribhuvan do, what did King Mahendra do. They have grown up in a Nepal that is more or less, which is, and they have come of age in a in a republic of Nepal and not a monarchic Nepal. So their historical perspective being what it is, they are also, the Gen Z is also a far more individualistic uh, person, is a far more individualistic generation. They are, they mobilize with social media, they relate to it like, like the fingers or thumbs on your hand, like we use our fingers and thumbs to write. So it's a different ball game, and they are not going to, they would be very wary of any kind of involvement, or if they were to see the India hand or the China hand. And so far, I don't see any evidence of any of these things.
Okay. Mr. Sood, thank you very much for the time you've given me. Thank you for sharing your understanding and analysis of this deeply concerning situation developing to the north in our neighbor, Nepal. I'm very grateful to you. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
A naked man has little to no influence on society. In clothes like this, you step out and you know that you're going to turn heads. You know that you're going to create an impression of a person who cares deeply about the way they look and has a finer eye for detail. And, that seems to be the Bombay Shirt Company way. What I really love about these clothes, and I really mean this, is this looks like a man has walked into the room. I like that. It's nice.